Nahum chapter 3. Last week we looked at the first 7 verses, and here we'll finish up the chapter. Now, of course, as we've been talking about throughout this book, it's a short book, but Nahum is wholly concerned with the prophecy of Nineveh's destruction. And so he kind of rehashes some things that he's talked about already in the book, but kind of from a different perspective. And so Nahum chapter 3, again, starting at verse number 8, he says this, "Art thou better than populous No, that was situate among the rivers, that had the waters round about it, whose rampart was the sea, and her wall was from the sea? Ethiopia and Egypt were her strength, and it was infinite. Put and Libum were their helpers. Was she carried away? She went into captivity. Her young children also were dashed in pieces at the top of all streets, and they cast lots for her honorable men, and all her great men were bound in chains. Thou also shalt be drunken, thou shalt be hid, thou shalt also seek a strength because of the enemy. All thy strongholds shall be like fig trees with the first ripe figs. If they be shaken, they shall even fall into the mouth of the eater. Behold, thy people in the midst of thee are women. The gates of the land shall be set wide open unto thine enemies. The fire shall devour thy bars. Draw thee waters for the siege. Fortify thy strongholds. Go into clay and tread the mortar and make strong the brick kiln. There shall the fire devour thee. The sword shall cut thee off, and it shall eat at thee like the cankerworm. Make thyself many as the cankerworm. Make thyself many as the locust. Thou hast multiplied thy merchants above the stars of heaven. The cankerworm spoileth and fleeth away. Thy crown are as the locust, and as the captains of the great grasshoppers, which camp in the hedges in the cold day. But when the sun arises, they flee away, and their place is not known where they are. Thy shepherds slumber, O king of Assyria. Thy nobles shall dwell in the dust. Thy people is scattered among the mountains, and no man gathereth them. There is no healing of thy bruise. Thy wound is grievous. All that hear the bruit of thee shall clap the hand over thee, for upon whom hath not thy wickedness passed continually?" And so here Nahum again looks forward. And again, that's always important to remember. He's looking forward. This is an event that he's reminiscing about in history. This is an event that has not yet taken place. And yet, as we talked about several weeks ago, Nahum writes about this particular battle in much more detail than in most of the historical records that we have found about the destruction of Nineveh. And so he's looking forward to the time of Nineveh's ruin. Now, this time he does so by comparing Nineveh, at least here at the beginning, to another city that had been defeated around the same time. And so Nahum makes this reference there in verse 8. He says, Art thou better than populous? No. That word N-O there. Nahum makes reference to No. Now this is, and I mentioned this in the introduction, but this is No-Aman, which is the Hebrew term for the city of Thebes. Okay, so we're talking about Thebes in Egypt. Now, when you talk about the historical city of Thebes, Thebes was very similar to the city of Nineveh. They had a lot of similarities between the two. The two most relevant to our text here is that they were both capitals of powerful nations, Thebes of Egypt, Nineveh of Assyria. They were both capitals of these powerful nations, and they were both surrounded by various water sources and one main well-known water source. Thebes was, obviously right by the Nile, being in Egypt, and as we talked throughout this, Nineveh was situated upon the Tigris. And so both of these cities had these water sources as defenses, natural defenses for the cities. It would be difficult to come upon them because you'd have to travel, across these rivers. And they both had walls and very fortified cities. And so there were a lot of similarities between Thebes and Nineveh. However, and this is why Nahum brings this up, Thebes was defeated. The city of Thebes was defeated, and they were defeated by the Assyrians, right? This is what makes this the most fascinating thing. It was the Assyrians themselves who came under King Ashurbanipal, the guy we've been talking about for the last several weeks, in 663. Right? And so in 663, the Assyrians came and they conquered the city of Thebes. And so Nahum here, he asks this, are you better than them? Right? Are you better than Thebes? And so Thebes, like Nineveh, had all the markings of invincibility. Right? This is the point that Nahum is making. Look at Thebes. Look at how nobody in the world at that time would have thought Thebes would have been destroyed in the way that they were. right? They had all the markings of invincibility. They had the Nile that was there as a protection for her. They had all the walls. They had all the defenses. And yet the Assyrians came and did to Thebes what they did. And so they had all these natural defenses. They had everything that you would have thought from a human standard that you would have needed to hold off an attack. They had those things. And yet the Assyrians were able to do this. And not only did they have the natural defenses, they had allies. They had allies with these various cities. It says in verse 9, Ethiopia and Egypt, Put and Lubim, all of these various nations that kind of surrounded the city of Thebes. They were allies. And so they had strength in natural defenses. They had strength in numbers. Again, they had everything that they could ask for. And it even says there in verse, I think it's verse 9. It says in verse 9, Ethiopia and Egypt were her strength, and it was infinite. It was infinite. That word infinite there literally means without end. And so they had, again, there's nothing that you could have wanted at this particular time with the technology that was available, with the defenses that were available. There was nothing that you could have asked for that Thebes didn't have. They had strength in every possible manner, but it was taken away. And so here, again, he's making the very apt comparison. And so it says she was carried away there at the beginning of verse 10. And so that word yet there, it was important, right? She had all of this, yet she was still carried away. She went into captivity. And then he goes in and talks about, again, we've talked about the brutality of the Assyrians, and here you see it on display a little bit. Her young children also were dashed in pieces at the top of all the streets. And they cast lots for her honorable men, and all her great men were bound in chains. Again, this is par for the course for the nation of Assyria. And so here he's saying, look back in history and look at the city of Thebes, because, verse 11, thou also shalt be. That's an important phrase. Thou also shalt be. Constable, he says, the same fate would befall Nineveh as befell Ammon. It too would lose its powers of self-defense and self-control. This would happen in connection with excessive wine drinking. Now, before I finish this quote there, you see there in verse 11, thou also shalt be drunken. Back in chapter 1, verse 10, he says, for while they be folded together as thorns, and while they are drunken as drunkards. And then in chapter 2, verse 5, he shall recount his worthies, and they shall stumble in their walk. And we talked about, when we went over that verse, that is likely a reference to drunkenness. His nobles, his military officers and captains, they weren't able to get to their positions as quickly as they should have been because they were drunk. Okay, so they were stumbling around like a drunk man. And so here we see another reference to drunkenness in verse 11. And so he said this would happen in connection with excessive wine drinking, but also in a metaphorical sense, because the Ninevites would drink a cup of wrath from Yahweh. They would vanish from the world. And so again, as we've talked about throughout the book of Nahum, that yes, it was a coalition of forces from the Babylonians, the Medes, the Scythians. It was a coalition of forces that came against the Assyrians and their capital city of Nineveh, but it was the hand of God behind it all. It was the hand of God bringing judgment upon this wicked people. And so though Nineveh's defenses were notorious, we talked about that. They were notorious. They would fall like a fig from a tree. He says there, still in verse number 12, he says, all thy strongholds shall be like fig trees with the first ripe figs. If they be shaken, they shall even fall into the mouth of the eater. And so a fig tree, when the figs get to the proper ripeness, essentially you don't even have to do anything. They'll just fall. Right? The fruit would literally just fall off the tree. And so if they were at a ripe enough stage and you begin to shake that tree, all the figs are just going to naturally fall. There's not much holding them there. And so here again, all they had from a human perspective, again, they had all the defenses you could want, both natural and man-made. They had it all. But these defenses would fall like figs from a tree, but not just figs from a tree in the sense that it would fall easily. It would fall into the very hands of those wanting to devour them, right? It's just like he said, you used the picture of a fig falling directly into the mouth of the eater, right? You're going to fall right into the hands of the one who literally wants to devour you. And so they would be devoured for, we mentioned this at the end of chapter 2. Nahum makes the reference to the lion-like nature of the Assyrians. And we talked about how the Assyrian kings kind of took that mantra upon themselves. They consider themselves as lion-esque. And it makes sense in the way that they just decimated people and were cruel in the things that they did to people. And so it honestly wasn't a description. But their warriors were at one point lion-like. Well, now here in chapter 3, verse number 13, he says, "Behold thy people," and that's a reference to their soldiers. "Thy people in the midst of thee are women." And so they go from the lion-like warriors to women. Now, obviously, this is a message that people downright hate today. And so as much as people today don't like a message like that Nahum is using women, not necessarily as a pejorative, because that's not his intent. He's speaking about the natural biological differences between men and women. And so as much as people today don't like this message, it is a biological fact that women are, on average, weaker than men, right? And I was thinking through this as I was typing this up, and the only reason that a biological fact like that, would be seen as anything demeaning today is the only reason it's seen as demeaning is because we are trying to force women into situations that they were never designed to be in, right? And so why is our military literally having to change the standards by which people are able to go into our military? They're having to lower that standard to allow women to come in because, again, women were never designed by God to do this kind of thing. They were created to be protected. Women were not created to be the protectors, right? They are as a precious jewel to be watched over and cared for by men, right? This is how they were created. Again, it's not a demeaning thing. It's a different role, right? God gave men a different role than he gave to women. And so here, this is whom is saying, you had these lion-like soldiers, and it was true, they did. He says, but now it would be like if you replaced their entire army and just put out a group of untrained women out there. Things aren't going to go well for that army. And America should pay attention. But nevertheless, because of their weakened and also drunken state, because, again, drunkenness has played a larger role in this, their gates would be as good as wide open to their enemies. Again, verse 13, the people in the midst of thee are women. The gates of thy land shall be set wide open unto thine enemies. They weren't really set wide open, but we talked about how there was a flooding that occurred and the walls started to crumble. And because of that, their gates were as good as wide open to their enemies. And because of all of this, they were going to be destroyed. Again, the fire shall devour thy bars. And he goes on here in verse 14. He says, draw thee waters for siege. Fortify thy strongholds. Go unto clay and tread the mortar. Make strong the brick kiln. Essentially, prepare everything that you're going to need for battle. Nahum's already done this a couple of times. And essentially what he's doing here is he's giving the Ninevites a sarcastic call to prepare for arms. Okay, that's what he's doing. You better prepare. You better make your preparations because the battle is coming. And the reason why it's sarcastic is because it didn't matter what preparations they made. Because at the end of the day, again, it was a human army, but this was a spiritual battle. This was judgment of God. And so here, again, and we mentioned this back in chapter 2 where he does kind of the same thing. People refer to this kind of thing as a taunt song. This is a taunt song. Nahum is calling them to do this, but again, their efforts will be in vain. And so they are told to make preparations and fortifications. However, again, it says, there shall the fire devour thee. Right? Again, you can make all the preparations you want. It's not going to work. So it says the coming army is going to destroy them like an oncoming army of locusts. Right? Again, verse 15, there shall the fire devour thee, the sword shall cut thee off, it shall eat thee up like the cankerworm. It's another word for locust. And so you picture a field having had a swarm of locusts come upon it. Nothing green is going to survive. It's going to be devoured. That's what they do. They're known for their destructive nature. And so they come in, and not just in ones or twos. They come in by the thousands, right? And so they're coming in as a group. They're devouring whatever is in their path, and then they're moving on. So he says this is essentially what's going to happen to you. And then he goes on, and on the flip side, he then compares the Ninevites to locusts. And so he compares the oncoming army to locusts, but also the Ninevites themselves to locusts. But in this particular case, locusts who had now shed their skin and then have flown away. He says there in verse 16, thou hast multiplied thy merchants above the stars of heaven, the cankerworm spoileth and fleeth away. That word spoileth there literally means to strip off. That's what that word means. And so you spoil it by stripping it away. And so again, the imagery that Nahum uses is like a locust shedding its skin, and having shed its skin, it flees. And then he uses the same analogy just in a different way. Verse 17, he says, "Thy crowned are as the locust," again, there's that word, "and thy captains as the great grasshoppers, which camp in the hedges in the cold day, but when the sun arises, they flee away, and their place is not known where they are." And so not only are the soldiers going to flee away, but now we're talking about the nobles. We're talking about the captains, the officers of this particular military. He says it's like they're hiding away as a locust on a cold day, and then when the sun finally comes out and warms everything up, they're gone, and you don't even know where they went. They just fled away. And so again, we're talking about complete and total destruction. And so this is the picture that Nahum is given to us. Now, interestingly enough, and we've made vague references to this, but interestingly enough, after this particular defeat, the city of Nineveh, to say that it was destroyed is an understatement. It was destroyed and utterly decimated, hidden to history until excavations finally found where it was in the 1800s. And so we're talking about thousands of years for this city that at this point had existed for thousands of years, was just gone. It was gone to history. And then finally, again, in the 1800s, they started to do excavations, and they found the ancient city of Nineveh, and it has given us a lot of historical insights into this particular time. But nevertheless, this picture that Nahum was given to us of this army coming and absolutely devouring the city of Nineveh, absolutely historically came true. And so this is well depicted in the final passage here of Nahum, verse 18. "The shepherds slumber, O king of Assyria. Thy nobles shall dwell in the dust. Thy people is scattered upon the mountains, and no man gathereth them." And so the shepherds slumber, and more than likely that slumber there is a reference to death. They've been slain. "Thy nobles shall dwell in the dust." Again, a reference to their being slain. "And the people are scattered," either having just run from the battle or taken in captivity. And so again, you see there at the end of verse 18, "and no man gathereth them." Again, it is a very interesting fact of history that this city that was so powerful and had existed for so long was just in a moment gone, never to return. And so again, this is the very clear moving of the hand of God. And then you have here this last verse 19, "There is no healing of thy bruise. Thy wound is grievous." And so there you have God prophesying, not only is destruction going to take place, there's no coming back from this, which again is exactly what happened. And he says this, "All that hear the bruit of thee shall clap the hands over thee, for upon whom hath not thy wickedness passed continually." And so again, the nations that are around you, instead of coming to your aid and coming for help, they're going to clap. They're going to rejoice, because your wickedness has been pervasive throughout the world. And so they're not going to be 1 inch sad or 1 iota sad over the destruction of the city. They are going to rejoice. They're going to clap their hands. They're going to be thrilled with the death of Nineveh. Now, I want to point out, Ralph Smith says this. He says, "The prophet observes that instead of sympathy or mourning for Nineveh, there will be universal joy, for the whole world had borne the brunt of Nineveh's cruel treatment." And upon the closing of Nahum here, I want to one more time go back to Constable, because I think he makes some very interesting points here, and I wanted to end with this. Only 2 books in the Bible, and this is a fascinating thing, only 2 books in the Bible end with rhetorical questions, Jonah and Nahum, both of which focus on Nineveh. Jonah ends on a note of compassion for Nineveh, but Nahum ends with assurance that God's patience had run out and the destruction of Nineveh was now certain. Is this book, and he goes on to say, is this book only about God's judgment on Nineveh and the Assyrians, or does it have a broader message? The reasons God brought Nineveh and the Assyrian Empire down are the same reasons he will humble any similar people. Any nation or city that lusts for conquest, practices violence and brutality to dominate others, abuses its power, oppresses the weak, worships anything but Yahweh, or seeks help from the demonic world, shares in Nineveh's sins and can expect her fate. Again, this is a message for nations all over the world. All over the world, nations are doing the same types of things that the Assyrians were destroyed for. Now, that is not to say that God is going to send a nation and do away with a nations like he did with Assyria, but it's also not to say that he won't. Right? We don't know how God's going to operate. Either it can happen now or it can happen later on. Right? One way or another, these nations will receive their just reward. And for most of them, if not all of them, that's going to be the wrath of God. And so again, yes, we can see that God is sovereign over all nations, over all people. He is sovereign over his creation. And this, more than anything, I think, is the message of Nahum, that God will do what is right and just with the people of this world. Not just his people. This isn't dealing with Israel at all. This is dealing with the people of the Assyrians and the Ninevites. And so, again, a fascinating book, and getting to look into the history of Nineveh, particularly after Jonah, after what happened with the book of Jonah. So I hope you found it interesting. I surely did.